Thanks, Susan. So Susan was actually part of this. A lot of this work was in Tom Seager as well. So this was inspired by the work that we've been doing at Columbia College and my partner Janell, that we've been working on a game called Pisces, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But in the process of doing that, we had started a class for doing serious games at Columbia College, and so this is sort of a presentation of that information. So the first part will be the theory, and then the second part will be more detail of what we actually do. So which part do I click?
Red arrow.
Red arrow.
Right.
Oh, you're going to click the slides?
No, should work.
What do I do? Oh, this one.
There you go.
Okay. So here's the information slide. So it's creating, so the idea is that I formed this term Gamiformics. It's just to carve out a different term for talking about games and the use of games for serious purposes. So normally you might have heard of gamification. So it's sort of a reaction to that. There are other terms out there, gameful, that people are trying to bend around as one example. But I just use the word gamiform. It comes from Star Trek, you know, when you like terraform a planet. So it's like terraforming a planet, but you're gamiforming it, is the basic idea. And then also, yeah, so that's the basic idea. So it's systems-based, constructivist. We have an ontologic person in this situation. We're interested in classical moral problems, which we'll talk about in terms of game theory. We try to capture emergent social interaction, and it's focused on game experiences. So I'll go through this list right now, so one by one, hopefully. So it's constructivist and constructionist. So Reggio Emilia is an inspiration. So Reggio Emilia is an Italian town, I think, actually. But they developed a pedagogy where they really focus on creating a space that comes from the point of view of the children. So actually at Columbia College Chicago, we have a very strong Reggio Emilia-based curriculum. In fact, you can get degrees in it at an undergraduate level. So just so that we can situate what pedagogies we're interested in. And then the other thing that's really interesting for games in specific is that we're design thinking versus, say, problem-based. So we're not so interested about specific fixed solutions and fixed problems. We're more interested in design thinking where you're challenging assumptions, you're iterating a lot, right? So games are known for failure, but really failure is just iterating an infinite amount of solutions to problems. So that's another distinction that, in terms of education, that is really important. And then as far as games, so Gamiformics, and to distinguish Gamiformics, so one of the things that distinguishes Gamiformics is that a lot of times when you look at games, you look at one game or you think of one game. But really, if you think about it, when you're like a children playing street hockey, there's multiple games occurring simultaneously, really, right? So so I was thinking street hockey, if a car came along, you had to say CAR, CAR. And that meant stop the game, let the car go by, and then embed back into the game, right? So we're really fluidly transitioning between different games and negotiating different games all the time. So the first distinction with Gamiformics is that you want to distinguish between thinking of a game as just one thing, but as multiple games that you're flipping through. And then in order to do that, I use some computer science terminology. I am a technologist by background, so I appropriate a lot of computer science terms and ideas. And this one is this idea of a loosely coupled system. It's a design pattern where if these represent multiple games, each game is autonomous, but then communicates in a loose way, which means a little bit of information. So they're still connected, but they're loosely connected. Versus gamification, usually the model is this, where in gamification you're trying to integrate a serious game and make it all one thing. From my work on serious games, the most important thing is really to go to this model, where you have the education outcomes separated from the game, and then that they are loosely coupled in terms of the communication between the two. And then for ontology, so ontology is really important. So for me particularly, it's an area of interest. But the idea of ontology is really what are the sets of things that you're starting with, the sets of objects that you're starting with. So in terms of working with people, I come up with an ontology. Instead of thinking of a person as an autonomous unit, I use a person, there's many ways of describing this and many theorists who describe how to think of it this way, but as a person in a situation. So here's a diagram where people are a function of who they are in terms of the personality and the situation as well, right? So, and so then the ontology here. Here's sort of a fun slide where if you ever get to go to pearly gates and they're deciding whether you go to heaven or hell, here is whether you're a cat person or a dog person, right? So that's one example of when you're with your cat or with your dog, it kind of helps identify. So that's another way of saying it. Or another way for saying ontology, I really like the French philosopher, so Gilbert Simondon is this, one of his quotes, is so many I could probably use, but information is the formula of individuation. So in other words, he looks at individuals as a function that individuates over time. So maybe another way of saying it is situationists, or however you want to describe it. I like to call it that really people are the calculus or the sum of their changes over time. So you could really represent identity by a calculus form. Another fun way of thinking of it. And then finally, another way of thinking in terms of the ontology is this Tony Schwartz from Resonance Chord. And I like this term is because he talks about it again that if you use this model of things are indeterminate, the message and the content is created after the type of response is determined. So a lot of the times, this is particularly interesting for games because when you play a game, you take on a role, right? So that role gets instantiated when you play the game, right? But if you think about it again with people, whenever you're talking to people, like right now I'm instantiated as higher status than you because I've been said I can talk, and so you have to behave in a certain way. So I'm instantiated in the moment as a person who predetermined that this is what I'm going to be, right? So we've all agreed that I am going to appear to you as higher status, as someone who knows something about the subject. So that's the idea of looking at the message, and the content is created after the type of response is determined, right? So it's flipping it around and looking at it from a different perspective. And then I put the ohm up there because, so the idea being is if we're resonating, we can also resonate with the sound. And so sometimes when you see in sort of the spiritual traditions that by resonating at the common tone, then we transform who we are in a more collective sense. And then epistemology, so the epistemological approach for Gamiformics is looking, and really what is that? It's the logic. So in this case, the problem is more that if identity is something that's emergent, so in other words, if we're looking at the ontology that identity is emergent and is captured, we have to come up with a different logic system. So it's been interesting to be here at the conference. Like I was talking with Johnny. In fact, the other day, he gave me some good terminology for this, which was that we were discussing that you need a logic to capture emergence, and there really isn't necessarily a logic to capture emergence. So if you're coming with an ontology where the individual is a function, you need a different epistemology or a way of capturing that knowledge. So for me, I've been obsessed and interested in this Indian philosophy of a great philosopher called Nagarjuna, which is called the tetralemma. And so it's basically the tetralemma is, it is not, it is both, it is neither. Right, so that's one way of saying it. So that's this on the right side, or your right side, yeah. And then, but it also maps to Aristotle, so which is really interesting, right? So if you take a very progressive Eastern view of Aristotle's terminology, you can map it to his thing, and I could talk your ear off about that, but but an easy way to understand is the beach ball. Okay, so this is my simple way of presenting the tetralemma. So if pretend there's two little flies, and one fly is on the red panel and one fly is on the blue panel. Okay? So the one fly is going to say, hey, the world is red. And then the other fly is going to say, it is not, which is the second part of the tetralemma. The world is blue. Right? And then the fly that will be on the top of the beach ball is going to say, no, you're both wrong, it's both. It's both red and it's blue. And then the fly who's drowned in the water is going to say, you're both wrong. It's neither red nor blue nor a beach ball. It's a beach ball embedded in the water. So in a lot of the ways, the tetralemma is just a way of representing simultaneous multidimensional truths in the same moment, right? So that's the idea of needing a different epistemology or different thing. So, okay, so then in the games, what we're interested in is how to negotiate moral influence or moral questions. So there's a famous example. This is just one example from this game called Farmville. So when it came out, they leveraged this idea that of situate moral, like that moral learning or moral things can be situated, so that if I give you something, you're more incentivized to give me something back. So this screen shows, it says, awesome, you've planted your mystery bulb and now you need to nourish it with some flower food. Ask your friends for some help, right? So part of that is if they ask you for your help, then you feel obligated to respond, just biologically from a biological level. And so they basically use this to get more players. So for them, from an economic perspective, they're basically manipulating people because then people will feel obligated and they're more likely to do it. Then they'll have more subscribers, and now it's a billion-dollar company that's not doing so well. So then what happens is this eventually becomes very negative, and people are like, wait a minute, I don't want to do this, and then Facebook gets some bad press, and then they stop this process so that you have to opt in, for example, right now. But there's a space of time where they went to become a billion-dollar company by using this sort of idea of situationism and how your idea is constructed by things that people do to you. So we're trying to do a similar thing, but in a positive way. So if you think of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory as a game, then we're going to run out really quickly. I got to finish this up because I got to get Janell on here. But if you think of it as him as a game, and at the end he's a dungeon master, it's really a moral tale because at the end he says how a good Charlie gives back the everlasting gobstopper, and then Willy Wonka as a dungeon master does that. So okay, so that's enough of this here. Let me get to Janell, and she can talk about some of the games that we did at Columbia. So.
Okay, so at Columbia College Chicago, it's an arts and communications college. Our students do take a couple science courses, but but they don't have a very strong science background. And particularly in our department, what students are coming there to accomplish is to learn how to be the next big game designer or the next big interactive media developer. So science is not the foremost on their mind. What we like to do, though, is to challenge them to think about creating work that's not just about entertainment, but can you create something that can change the world and be entertaining? Can you do both? And we were really fortunate to work with Dr. Seager and with Susan to introduce these ideas of the tragedy of the commons through a game called Pisces that the two they developed with a grant, I believe. And with that game, there are two essential moral questions. Like as Bill talked about, we're trying to get them to consider the moral component of what they are building. So what are my responsibilities to others? And what am I willing to risk in my own well-being to meet these obligations? So Pisces is a really interesting game, and if you haven't played it, I really encourage you to track down Dr. Seager or Susan and ask them more about it, because we won't have time to cover that in depth here. But one of the things that it did was when Tom played it with my class is that their grade depended on how they participated in the game. And part of the game was to essentially take more from a common resource and leave less for the other students in the class. So the students who got the opportunity to start the game started out with a really high score and were probably going to get A's, and the students who just ended up at the end of the round were going to probably fail. And then my students had to consider that, you know, am I willing to get an A and for somebody else to get an F? So that was really interesting for us. So what we did in a senior year-long capstone course was we asked them to take 2 weeks to really think about these issues. So our students were coming into this class wanting to develop a thesis project. It was going to be a year long. It was probably going to be something that had nothing to do with science or nothing to do with something that was serious, because that's not what the class is. But we wanted to challenge them at the beginning to make something small, iterative, to address these issues, to try to inspire them to think differently about what they were going to do for the rest of the year. So this one called Bunnies had 2 to 4 players that collectively manage a vegetable garden, and as you play it, just like in the Tragedy of the Commons, there's a common food source, and as you move along and go through all 4 players, and it was kind of a literal sort of translation between the Pisces, which was a fish pond, and a carrot field. So here's some more pictures of it. This one was a little bit more interesting because they didn't take quite such a literal approach. In this one, players are digging for gold. This gold in the mine happens to be situated under a town. So as they dig deeper in, they have to build structural supports to hold up the mine. And that structural support is very expensive. So do they try to get more gold, more money, and less support? Or do they actually put up more supports and make sure that it's a sturdy thing? And at the end, when it inevitably fails, the mine collapses and the town on top of it collapses with it. So there is a sort of feeling of what you've done. And here's some examples. Again, this was only 2 weeks. So in terms of like this is what's called a prototype. So they're not fully finished in terms of how they're fleshed out. But what was interesting to us was the amount of learning and growth that happened in such a short time with these students. And so that's you have unleashed Armageddon upon these people. So anyway, we've been using Gamiformics. I also teach a class at Columbia called Simulations and Serious Games, where we spend an entire semester working through issues like this. But what we've tried to do is expand that out into more classes and give our students more opportunity of creating through the lens of Gamiformics. And there's everybody who contributed to this, so thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. What's in the back?
Very interesting. So, is there a way that we can get themes to use in our classroom?
Yes, actually they are playable, and we could work with the students and make them available if you're interested. Just give me your email address and we can follow up with you.
And then for the Pisces game, I've been the last few years making a digital version of Pisces, and then so you can talk to Tom probably or Susan more about getting it. But then, so I'm more the tech master on that, and so it's basically run through Twitter. So that was part of the making it accessible. We just have to spin it up for your college, but you should be able to play it. So contact them.
It seems like there's a lot of learning going on, both for the students who develop the games, but also for the students who play the games. So there's like learning and then mental learning. Do you use any kind of assessment measures on those two different levels to see what students get out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was actually meeting with someone last week about doing assessment. So we don't have, right now our assessment's pretty much anecdotal, so we haven't done anything too formal with it yet, but I'm in the negotiations with, there's a company that uses an evidence-based system from Stanford, and so we're looking at trying to do that so that you can build some assessment component into it so you can capture it that way and get something more digital. So.
And in my classes right now, the assessment is only on the students who are building the work. So we have rubrics and we track those over time between the classes. But that's something that we're definitely looking into, is the students who play the game, some assessment on that.
Just to add to that real quick, it's really tough. I mean, so the central part of a lot of these games is morals and ethics, and so to assess someone's improvement of morals and ethics, right, you'd almost have to follow them around for years afterwards to see what decisions they're making. So it's something we really struggle with.
One of the things I do teach a course where that's a capstone course where part of it is character improvement. So I use from University of Wisconsin, David Schaefer's work, which is called epistemic games. And so they use an epistemic framework where you look at 5 components: knowledge, skills, values, decision-making, and identity. And then he tracks it in a comparative way, like based upon some feedback to see by plotting points over time. And so he has very sophisticated tools and things like that. So we've been planning to implement that. And I use that as a basic rubric for my class, for grading it, to say, have they changed in identity? Have they changed in decision making? Or is there evidence of them making decisions that I can support within that framework? But I haven't done anything formal in terms of talking.
So how many students participated in making each game, Spierre?
Actually, I can show you. So on this one, there were 6 students who were involved in this one. And in the previous one, Bunnies, there was less students. But what was really interesting is one of the things that we challenged them to do is in their senior year, migrate from being a student who's given an assignment to a leader who leads their team. And everyone has to take turns being a leader of the team. And they actually went outside of the school, went to another school, and recruited someone to do the graphics for their game, for the Bunnies game. So that was really great for us to see that they weren't just feeling limited to who was in their group, and that they were feeling strong enough to reach out and recruit others to come.
And we have 2, we do what's unique for our college is we do 2 capstones. So one is a large group of 35 students who make a game, and then that game is up their decision, so it's not necessarily a social problem. But so that's a 35 group with a traditional hierarchy. And then I teach an independent, indie style is what we call it. We use the Scrum model, where it's more teams of 4 to 5 to 6. That's very agile. And so this year I had like 30 students. I had about 10 games. And then they all made about 10 games that were based upon using a small team. So we have basically 2 models of production. And then hopefully what we try to do is get them to do both. So the small team as well as the large team, so they learn to do both types of team practices.
All right, we actually have to move on, sorry, but I'm sure you guys can talk afterwards.